Today I will discuss Kant's account of morality and then use it to discuss the moral worth of animals. As usual, a bibliography of all texts used will be available in the description. Kant's moral philosophy has an emphasis on what he calls his categorical imperative, which is a principle which states that we should act according to maxims that we can will to be universal laws. A maxim is a principle which a person uses to understand if their actions are morally right. So Kant believes that we as moral agents should only act based on what we universally agree is morally right. Kant values rationality and autonomy as a basis of moral worth. This excludes animals from direct moral considerations as they are not rational beings by Kant's definition. This is because animals cannot create maxims and therefore moral laws. In this video, I will introduce alternate views from Kant like utilitarianism and feminism. Finally, I will discuss revisions of Kant and how their inclusions are more apt for modern views on animals and how they should be treated morally. Ultimately, I will reveal that while Kant does provide a plausible account, it is only when revised with modern views. Kant has a firm distinction between humans as rational beings and animals as non-rational beings. Animals cannot reason to the level of humans and cannot create moral laws for themselves. Therefore, Kant thinks they lack intrinsic moral worth as they lack dignity. Animals, according to Kant, are means to human ends and are not ends in themselves. He also believes that we have no direct duty to animals, only indirect duties. He writes that our supposed duty to animals is only direct duty to ourselves. He believes that treating animals well is to preserve our moral character amongst other humans. It dulls our shared feelings of their suffering. Other humans would judge our moral worth if we were to act sadistically towards animals. Kant's anthropocentric framework allows for harm to befall animals if it doesn't degrade human morality. He sees respect for animals as respect for human property. However, Kant doesn't consider non-domesticated animals which are not human property. Kant is correct that we shouldn't harm animals, so he is correct about our actions. But his reasoning is wrong. Most modern approaches would suggest we shouldn't harm animals because of how it affects the animal, not how it affects the owner of the animals. This account also fails to consider that if a person is cruel to animals in private, we need to consider if we are exempt from the harm that is caused, as our moral worth would remain intact. A counter to this point would be Kant's suggestion that we have an indirect duty to not harm animals, as if we did it, it could cause us to develop feelings of cruelty which could spill over into our direct duty of how we treat humans. This is another good point from Kant to explain why we shouldn't complete actions of cruelty, but still doesn't acknowledge the suffering of animals, rather only the suffering of humans. Kant creates a hierarchy to further his opinion. Mere inorganic matter, which is minerals, without sensation, plants, endowed with sensation and choice, animals. Kant thinks humans are a step beyond this hierarchy, and while he is acknowledging that animals do feel pain, this still does not give them a basis for moral worth. But focusing on humanity by Kant is seen as an unfair basis today, as human connection with animals, as well as our understanding of them, is greater than in the past. Modern science, which Kant couldn't have accounted for, suggests that animals have complex feelings and experiments have confirmed them. It is not a conceptual idea. Kant's argument also leaves animals open to exploitation, as if we do not view them as rational agents, it is permissible to use our greater intelligence to exploit them for personal reasons, such as product testing or experimentation. This is why today we have animal rights activists, as it is seen that factors outside of rationality give animals moral worth. Modern philosophers like Gruen and Monsó offer more inclusive, ethical approaches to include animals in the basis of moral worth. They base their views off feminist and empathetic approaches, suggesting that relationships, emotions, and vulnerability should be considered, and not just rationality as Kant suggests. Gruen and Monsó critique Kant's argument, suggesting he fails to consider the moral relevance of the suffering of animals. Meerkats in the Kalahari Desert are known to sacrifice their own safety by staying with sick or injured family members. If these animals can understand when their own species are suffering, then animals clearly experience suffering. Kant basing moral worth on rationality and ignoring suffering is wrong, as critics argue that if a being can experience suffering, then they have moral worth, as suffering is a moral concern in ethical systems. However, our understanding of suffering is greater due to higher levels of cognition than that of an animal. So it is fair to understand why Kant believes suffering is not a recognition of moral value, as if it can be measured at different levels, then a baseline entrance level for what can be considered to have moral value cannot be ascertained. Peter Singer offers a utilitarian perspective with a focus on sentience and not just rationality as a basis for moral worth. He argues, like other critics, that all things capable of suffering deserve equal moral consideration. Actions should be judged based on their impact on the well-being of society and not autonomy. The companionship of animals increases their moral worth to humans as they feel strong bonds. This shows that we as rational agents can legislate moral laws to assign moral worth to animals. So according to Singer, animals matter not because of what they are, but because of how they can be affected. He argues against Kant's focusing on humans, saying if an animal can experience suffering, then they have an interest to avoid suffering, and all interests are worthy of moral consideration. He compares Kant's speciesism to racism, suggesting that just because something is different doesn't mean it should be excluded. On top of this, Kant's perspective of viewing animals as the property of humans and how we treat them is based on how it affects their owners is akin to slavery. Kant's view assumes that people see all humans as equal, but if a human sees a human who Kant would say is a rational being with moral worth as nothing more than a subhuman without rationale and therefore any moral worth, and that person is the property of another, then that makes it permissible to own slaves and treat them however you wish. Singer does acknowledge that Kant is correct that rationality does explain why we act morally, but doesn't decide what is worthy of being considered to have moral worth. So he does believe Kant is correct to an extent. However, Kant's perspective is too narrow to align with more modern views like his. Christine Korsgaard agrees with Kant that animals are not autonomous. However, she does think that animals still have lives that matter to them. She proposes that we as rational agents can choose to include animals in legislating moral laws out of consideration for their moral value. This argument shows their agreement with Kant, as we have rational agency, so we can legislate moral laws and animals can't, but points out that rational agency is not a basis for moral worth, just a baseline for who decides what can be considered to have moral worth. So they are expanding the scope of Kant's views. Korsgaard writes, some philosophers who deny that rationality is the distinctive characteristic of humanity would still agree that normative self-government is both definitive of personhood and distinctive of human beings. This suggests that self-governance is a distinctive feature of human beings, so the ability to legislate moral laws cannot be a feature of animals. But she goes on to question that surely animals must have reasons for why they act in certain ways. Korsgaard suggests that self-governed actions, like instinctive response to stimuli, is also a feature of animals, and like us, they do not think about the need for this to happen. They happen on instinct. She then questions if animals can acknowledge that these instincts happen just as humans do. So if there is a level of self-governance within an animal, and there are philosophers who see this as a distinctive feature of personhood, then surely animals must have moral worth as humans do. This point is an expansion of Kant, as Korsgaard has expanded the scope of his argument by pointing out that animals have self-governance and therefore moral worth. She acknowledges that the level of self-governance they possess is not the same level as humans. To expand upon this point, Kant's view would also fail to include people with severe mental disabilities or children, as they are incapable of understanding morality, just as animals are. So if we consider them to have moral worth, even though they are not rational, then animals should also be considered to have moral worth. This makes Kant's argument closer to a direct duty view, suggesting we have moral obligation to consider animals, as it is wrong to be inconsiderate of them, as they do have moral worth due to their ability to suffer and a level of self-governance, even if they lack rationale. Animals' lives matter to them, even if they do not understand morality. Korsgaard disagrees with Kant's hierarchy, which was mentioned previously, stating that Karl Marx pointed out that human beings are the only animals that actually think of themselves as members of a species. This suggests that only humans think of themselves as part of a collective, and animals do not. We view them as separate from our collective, as they do not contribute. This causes us humans to think that animals were put on the planet for our use, to better the collective, which explains why Kant believes they do not have moral worth. However, we know that rationally, animals have their own interests, such as survival and reproduction, so therefore they must have moral worth, as these are features of betterment for their collective. Korsgaard effectively reframes Kant's views, suggesting that the source of moral obligation lies not in something being a rational being, but in the ability to recognize others' interests. As a conclusion, Kant does offer a plausible account for the moral status of non-human animals, as he is correct in his belief that animals are not rational agents like humans. However, excluding animals ignores features such as their ability to suffer, pursue goals, and create social bonds as a basis for moral concern. Kant's theory has a great effect on real-world applications. His point can make things like factory farming uphold human dignity, even though today these sort of practices are heavily criticised by utilitarians. Critics like Gruen and Monsó suggest that worth stems from vulnerability and sentience, not just rationality. Korsgaard does maintain that Kant's view that rational agents are who judge moral worth, but points out there are many considerations that can mean that moral worth should be extended to animals. Overall, I think Kant's emphasis on rationalism is integral for creating a basis for moral standards, as without rationalism, moral legislations could not be created. But it is important to understand that a more inclusive moral perspective would better reflect modern views of non-human animals, as they do have features that make them worthy of moral consideration.